Okay, everybody can see that, hopefully.
Yep.
Yes? Okay.
Yes.
All right, so our topic for today is Judea in the time of Herod. And I want to try and accomplish a couple of things. One, to first set the geographical and historical context and look at his life, various events in the context of evaluating how effective he was as a king. So I'm going to ask your opinion as we go along. How effective was he? Because his reputation, at least in some quarters, are rather negative. So we'll see how you view it. And then we'll take a more detailed look at a few of his building projects, which are really amazing. Okay. And that includes the temple, Second Temple, Caesarea, his burial monument called Herodium. Yeah. So here is the map of the Roman Empire. The red was under control in 100 BC. The yellow was in control at the time of Caesar's death in 44 BC. And this is what we need to pay attention to. Then later, the green is after Augustus. So you can see that starting in Western Europe, that essentially all of France and Belgium, a little bit of Germany, all of Spain and Portugal, what's now Switzerland, Italy, a good portion of Yugoslavia and Greece, and the Anatolian region. And by this time, Judea, whose monarchy was the Hashmoneans. The Hashmoneans were the successors to the Maccabees. So this was an independent, had been an independent kingdom after they rebelled against the Hellenistic Seleucid Empire. And by this time, Rome had really established itself as the Mediterranean power. And though they allowed in Judea a king, essentially it was critical that the administration was to Rome's liking. And what did Rome like? They wanted stability. They wanted you to pay your taxes, and they did not want you to allow their enemy. The major enemy here was Parthia, which was the second main iteration of a Persian empire, right in here, and went all the way out to Afghanistan. And so Rome and Parthia were in competition for who was going to control the Eastern Mediterranean. You can see here that Egypt was still semi-independent, which was going to change over time. And then you had parts of North Africa, which were controlled by Rome. All right. Any questions about that? No. All right. Now, this is what Herod's empire or Herod's country looked like. This is at the height of Herod's regime, which we're not into yet, but just want to give you an idea. It's the black line. That is Herod's empire. And this was about the largest that the Jewish state had ever been in history. Solomon's area may have been somewhat larger, but not by much. So you can see that the Galilee is part of his kingdom. And then a nice chunk of Syria, part of his kingdom. And then part of the East Bank, which is now Jordan, and then going down through Samaria to Judea and Idumea. Now, Idumea is important in our story. These were Arab-like peoples who were conquered by the Hashmoneans in the time of Herod's grandfather, and they were forced to become Jews. And that was unusual, but because they occupied a very important position here, they were forced. Unfortunately for them, even though they were forced and they became observant Jews, they were never fully recognized as Jews. It was always sort of the second-class Jews. And unfortunately for Herod, he was an Idumean. Okay. So again, keep in mind what makes a king great. And we'll look at that. Now, here is a sort of summary of Herod's biography so you can get some of the major events in your mind. His father, Antipater, was an Idumean official in the Hasmonean kingdom. And as was typical of his family, they were very good at cultivating relationships with the Roman leadership. He befriended Julius Caesar, and it was Julius Caesar who ultimately elevated Antipater. Even though there was a Hasmonean king, who was ever in control in Rome, had a lot to say about what went on in this part of the empire. So he became what was called the procurator of Judea, essentially the administrator. Now, at age 25, Herod is made administrator of the Galilee by his father. So this is the first time. I don't know why this is hanging out here. This is the first time that Herod, as a young man, has administrative power. Now, at age 31, Herod meets Mark Antony, who was to play an important role. Now, if you remember, Caesar was assassinated in 44 BC because a faction within the Roman Senate was afraid that he was going to become essentially an emperor. And then there was a civil war between the people who had lined up against Caesar, and on the other side was Octavian, who later became Augustus, the first emperor, and Mark Antony. And Mark Antony, they won, and they divided the empire. The west was controlled by Octavian, and the east was controlled by Mark Antony. So Mark Antony became the most important Roman for people who were living in Judea. And he liked Herod, liked what he saw, and appointed him, continued him as one of the administrators of Judea. Now, the Hasmoneans, there was two factions between two brothers, and they were fighting for who was going to become the king. And one faction went to the Parthians and said, look, we're going to welcome you in here, but you have to help me win the civil war. And essentially the other prince was aligned with Antipater and Herod. He was driven out of Judea, and Herod then went to Rome. Now, he sailed to Rome in the wintertime, which was very dangerous. The Mediterranean, especially to go across the Mediterranean in the wintertime, you risked death. But he did that to try and go and convince the Romans they should back his prince, and obviously help them drive the Parthians out. Now, the Romans would not have sat still for the Parthians being able to split their empire in half, which is what would have happened. Now, this shows to some degree how dangerous it is for a place to be between two major powers. Historically, this is not a good place to be. And you can look at Poland, you can look at Korea, you go around the globe, and if you're in between two major powers, it's bad for you. And here, this became a war zone between the Parthians and the Romans, with those in the Hasmonean side that sided with the Romans. For 3 years, there was fighting in Judea until the Parthians were driven out. Now, when Herod went to Rome to plead with the Romans to help them drive the Parthians out and also to support his prince, the Romans listened and they said, "We don't want your prince as king of Judea. You're going to be king of Judea." This was not what Herod intended. He was there. He wanted to be in the background, just like his father had been as administrator, but knew that there was going to be opposition to him as an Idumean to become king of Judea. But you didn't argue with the Romans. If they said they wanted you to do that, you did that. So, he did. And after the Parthians were driven out, he became king of Judea, and it was not a popular thing among the people. Now, to try to legitimize himself in a way, he married a Hashmonean princess named Mariamne. He loved her like crazy, and she hated him.
Oh.
Yeah. So this was not a good marriage in terms of the future, but she had to go along with it in order to keep the Hashmonean, faction, having some power, even though Herod was the king. Now, constantly after that, there was intrigue on the part of the Hashmoneans to try and push Herod out. And this began this cycle of distrust on the part of Herod. Now, it was not uncommon in this part of the world to kill parts of your family if they were threatening your security. This was not.
Some people still do that.
That's right. Some people still, like Kim Jong-un, right?
Yes.
Yeah. But as time went on, Herod really became very, very paranoid, and he went over the top. But, they say that even paranoids have enemies, and he definitely had enemies. Now, his mother-in-law and his wife convinced him to make Mariamne's brother the high priest. Now, the high priest carried a lot of weight in Israel, Judea at the time. This was a very good-looking young man, and the crowds just went wild when they saw him. They were just happy, 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 and that just drove Herod nuts. Also, the mother-in-law was very into intrigue. So Herod arranged for this boy to be drowned. Yeah, they threw a party. There's a big swimming pool. Herod liked swimming pools. He had a swimming pool in almost every palace that he built, and he built a lot of palaces. And a game was started where they were dunking each other, and then somehow this kid never came up alive. So, obviously, this just intensified the antipathy. And I don't want to go into all of the details here, but ultimately, he killed his wife, too. But he was so infatuated with her, he had her put in a vat of honey so she would not deteriorate. And for years, he went and talked with her. He obviously had second thoughts about what he had to do. But in any case, the Roman Empire was not stable. So ultimately, Mark Antony and Octavian fought it out for who was going to be in control. And remember, Mark Antony was in control of the eastern part of the empire. So Herod was part of his, administrative area, and Herod, was loyal to him. And Octavian had the West. And one of the reasons that Mark Antony lost was that he was so besotted by Cleopatra. And we'll get into that in 2 weeks when we talk about Alexandria. So besotted with her, he spent too much time with her and not enough time paying attention to the empire. And ultimately, he was defeated, she died, and he died. And at that point, Herod had to try and get Octavian to keep him in power, because he had sided with Mark Antony. So again, in the wintertime, he sailed to Rhodes, an island where he still was called Octavian. Octavian was encamped, and he didn't apologize for backing Mark Antony. He said, "Look, I was under his administration, but I will be absolutely loyal to you." And Mark Antony was very impressed. Not Mark Antony. Octavian was very impressed, and so Herod maintained his power, and from then on was a very strong backer of Augustus, to the point where he built temples to Augustus in Judea, in areas that were primarily pagan areas. He took a couple of areas like Caesarea, Sebasti in the Galilee, and essentially made them predominantly pagan cities. And that was a way of saying, look, we understand your culture, we honor your culture, and anybody who from the empire who wants to come and feel comfortable can come to these areas and, whatever. Also, amazingly, Herod paid for buildings and projects in other parts of the empire. The Olympic Games, for example, he paid for the Olympic Games. It was failing financially, and he stepped in and said, I'll pay for it. He built buildings in Syria. He built buildings in Egypt. I mean, he really was trying to very adroitly keep good relations with the Romans, because he knew it was absolutely critical. And if there was going to be any self-government within a province, it had to be in the context of being a loyal part of the Roman Empire. All right, well, let's move on. Let's consider some of these building projects, because they are amazing, absolutely amazing. How many of you have been to Caesarea?
I have.
Yeah, okay.
The aqueduct is still standing. You can.
Yeah. Now, in the Mediterranean, there is a small number at this time of really good harbors. And there was trade that went all around the Mediterranean. And this was going on way before the Roman Empire. I mean, we have wrecks from 1300 BC that had products from every part of the Mediterranean. So this is a very, very profitable enterprise. But if you didn't have a harbor, if you didn't have a major harbor, your chunk of the trade was much less. Now, one of the themes that Herod had is he was not stopped by the physical limitations of a project. Now, he built this harbor in an area that had no natural harbor at all. It was just a coastline. And he said he wanted the harbor there, and he defied essentially the usual building practices in order to do this. Now, he also wanted a city that was basically a Roman city, all right? So that, again, Augustus, who was the emperor, could see his loyalty. So this just gives you an idea of what the city looked like. He built these, they're called moles, all right? And I'll tell you how he built them in a bit. This mole here, this mole here. He had a lighthouse here. You entered the harbor like this. This was the outer harbor. Then you went in here. This was the inner harbor area. Here was where things were unloaded. And you can see right here is a temple to Augustus. And you could see this, out way out to sea. You saw the lighthouse and you saw the temple to Augustus. And it had all the accoutrements of a Roman city, as we'll see in a bit.
Where was the theater?
Say again?
Where was the theater?
You'll see it. You'll see it. It's over to the right, the southern part.
Okay.
I have all of those details.
I'm sure you do. I'm looking at this stuff. It's fascinating.
Yeah. All right. Now this is what it looks like now, which is just a tiny bit of the harbor. This is just the inner harbor. All right. So I showed you the parts of it. Now, one thing was just amazing. One of the problems in a harbor is silt. Okay, the harbor silts up, and then you have to dig it out. Well, Herod's engineers came up with a solution where they built these sluice channels, and because of the way the water went, the silt was pushed out automatically by the flow of the water and went through these channels. He built a breakwater to protect the moles. It just was very ingenious. But the problem was, how do you build a harbor out in the sea? Because most harbors were made of cement. You couldn't afford building it with just blocks of granite or whatever. It's just too expensive. So what he did was, he had heard that the Romans had developed a kind of concrete that would set underwater. If you mixed it with ash from Pompeii, from Vesuvius, there was a certain kind of ash with the other components. You could put it in these wooden frames, okay, sail them out to where you want to put them, dump in the concrete, it would sink, and then become part of these moles. And this was how it was done. And today, you can still dive down and see some of the wood frames that's been left over for 2,000 years, essentially. So that's how he built the harbor. This is a picture of how it looked, looking out at the lighthouse. All right. Now this is a view looking south. Okay. And you see here the temple to Augustus, right? And these are the wharves. Okay. This is actually Herod's palace. We'll get into that a bit. And this was a hippodrome, a full hippodrome. Just like, in Ben-Hur, when they were showing you that the chariot races, that was true. I mean, they had them. Okay, this is an aerial view just to give you an idea of what's there today and then how big the harbor really was. And it was earthquakes that wrecked the harbor. Okay, that ultimately was the destruction and took a number of centuries. And then it just limited the construction to this smaller area. Here's the hippodrome again. This is an aqueduct that takes water from the mountains in the Galilee and brings it down to the city. Okay, there's your theater. All right, this is what it looked like when it was constructed. This is actually, the Greeks developed this style, and the Romans just adopted it. This is where the plays were held, and people sat. Now, this is still used, by the way. The Israelis still use it. I don't know if any of you have gone to a concert there, but I remember reading about a concert that I would have loved to go with Eric Clapton. sit there and listen to Eric Clapton and look at the Mediterranean. Sounds pretty good to me. Now, this is Herod's palace.
Wow.
Right here. Okay, it's sticking out. It's right near the Hippodrome. Here's the theater, amphitheater. Now, notice that he puts it out, essentially sticking way out into the sea. Why did he do that? Well, yeah, he probably liked the view, but the other thing is he was very concerned with having a defensible palace. Wherever he was, his palace was half palace and half fort, like Masada, for example. Here's another shot of the temple to Augustus. It was a beautiful city. It really was a beautiful city. And it's the second most popular tourist attraction in Israel, the first one being Jerusalem. All right, the temple. Now, one of the things that Herod wanted to do, I mean, he did Caesarea for two major reasons. One, to show that he was part of the Roman Empire, and two, because it made a lot of money. In other words, when ships came in, they paid a duty to be able to come into the harbor. And the economy of Judea, which had been sort of for centuries, took off. This is one of the reasons why it took off. And he used that money to expand the agriculture in Judea. So he used his money wisely. Now, the other thing he did that was a major undertaking was to rebuild the temple. Now, you remember the Babylonians destroyed the Temple of Solomon in 586. And when the Persians allowed the Jews to return in the 520s, they came back and they just sort of slapped together something that supposedly people cried when they looked at what they were able to build after coming out of Babylonia, as compared to what Solomon's temple looked like. So in a bid to try to make the Jews happy, Herod said, okay, I'm going to rebuild the temple and make it a grand building. There was a lot of opposition. They didn't trust him. They felt that it would be disruptive. They didn't want people who were not priests to be able to go into the temple, parts of the temple. So Herod, first of all, he said, to show you that I'm serious, I'll have all of the building materials set out before we start anything. And there was a tremendous amount of money. Some of these columns were one piece of stone. Just an amazing amount of expense. And he got it all together. And then he trained priests to be able to build the parts of the temple, the Holy of Holies and other really holy parts of the temple. They built that. So he had to train the priests to be able to build it. So he bent himself, out of shape to do this for the Jewish people, with the idea that they would, accept him. Did they like the temple? Yes. Did they accept him? No. All right. Now, the building. This is a picture of David's part of Jerusalem, and there was no temple at this point. And then Solomon took part of Mount Moriah and built his temple in around 950, right? And then it was destroyed and they put up something, I don't know. I've never seen a pictorial of whatever they built when they got back. But essentially, this gives you an idea. This is Solomon's temple. This is Herod's temple.
Wow.
Now, the first thing that had to be done is a platform had to be built here, because the terrain, it's not flat. It's a hill. I mean, I show you. It's a hill. You got to flatten it out. And that was bigger construction project than building the temple itself. It was a tremendous achievement to be able to do this. So they built a platform first, and then they built the temple. In the meantime, he had to keep the temple functioning while he was building the platform, so that, all of the holidays and everything else was able to be done. I'm not sure how he built. Maybe he just used this part of the platform. I don't know what, but he was able to do it. All right, here's a model of the temple, and we'll get into the different parts. But he had to build up this platform, and he used stone for this. Okay, and one of the reasons why the temple walls were able to withstand all the earthquakes were the massive stone blocks that were put in here. And the way it was arranged also, it was sort of steeped, a little bit, each level was a little bit in. Apparently was able to withstand earthquakes. Now, this is the Antonia Fortress, which is where the Romans were garrisoned. And all around the Temple Mount are these porticos. Okay. And this was what's called the Grand Portico, which we'll look at in a bit. All right. So this again just shows you, the process of laying down the foundation, the platform. And this area here is the Western Wall, right here. This is what survives out of all of this building. So as you know, the Western Wall is not the Western Wall of the temple. It's the Western Wall of the wall that delimits the temple area. And here is Robinson's Arch. You can the reason why it was called Robinson's Arch is that an archaeologist named Robinson, discovered it, and this was one of the major ways that people got into the Temple Mounts. I'll show you a picture of that. Now, this area here is equal to 6 football fields. It is big. This is an idea of what the stones were like, and this sort of beveling is typical of Herodian stones. And one of the ways they use it was help them line up one stone next to the other. They were able to line up these bevels and make sure that it was in a straight line. How did they do the quarrying? It was Jerusalem stone. We have the quarries. We have several quarries that I'll show you pictures of. They'd use a pick, and by the way, they've recovered some of these picks, and they would cut in a channel, and then they would put in wood, and they'd wet the wood, and the wood would expand and help them crack help them separate the blocks one from another. Here's a quarry that you can still see near the Siloam pool. All right, so what about the temple? What did it look like? All right, here's the direction: north, south, west, east. So we'll start west, and this is the Wailing Wall up here. Okay, this is north. And so one way you got in was, and they had a number of gates, but the major gate was right here, the south gate. And you'd walk upstairs and you'd get into the royal stoa first. Now, what did they do with all of this space that was outside the temple? Well, it was a meeting place. It was a place where people did business. At times, Herod would address his people here. It was a multi-use thing, but this was a beautiful structure, and I'll show you pictures. Archaeologists were able to recover some of the flooring of the Temple Mount, and these beautiful tiles were used all through the Temple Mount. It wasn't just a flat stone; it was just a gorgeous thing. So there was an area of the temple itself where if you were not Jewish, you couldn't go in. So the first court was called the Women's Court. Men and women were allowed to go in there. After that, it was just men, okay, in here, and then it was just priests doing the sacrifice, and then going into the Holy of Holies, it was only the high priest. Here's another picture of it. Now, they called this court the court of the Gentiles because anybody could go there. And the temple became famous throughout the Roman world. In other words, there were tourists, non-Jewish tourists, who came to see the temple. And even Titus, who ended up looting the temple, said it was one of the most beautiful buildings he'd ever seen. Didn't stop him from looting it, but because the Jews had rebelled. It also greatly increased Herod's popularity among Jews in the diaspora. So everybody knew about it. People in Alexandria, the people Jews in Rome, the Anatolia, even the Babylonian Jews would come and visit the temple, and were extremely proud of it. This was a major accomplishment. And this just shows you some of the block and tackle they used to move the stones around. Now here's the grand stoa that I was showing you before. So these columns, one solid piece of stone, which is just that's not usually how these columns were made. They were made in blocks, one on top of another. These were solid stone. The floor looked like this. Hold on. That's Robinson's Arch. Gives you some idea of how one of the ways they got in. This was really the major. There was a door, a gate only for Elijah. Okay, so when it was time for the Messiah to come, he or she had their own door. Nobody else used it during the time of the temple. All right, this is what Robinson's Arch looks like now. All right, well, I'll get to the flooring. I don't know why it's not in the right order, but now this is solid. This is gold leaf that Herod put in, and you could see it for miles and miles when the sun hit it. And this was all Jerusalem stone here. It was just a gorgeous thing. This is a slide showing you the parts of the interior of the temple, and this I wouldn't call it a door exactly. It's a screen. This screen limited the Holy of Holies, and the high priest went in there once a year. Now, when a Roman named Pompey came, he decided he wanted to see what was in there. And apparently, the Ark of the Covenant was no longer in the Holy of Holies by that time. The Babylonians probably took it when they took the temple. There was just a Torah there. at least according to Pompey. Okay, here's the decoration on the floor, what was on the floor of the temple. Now remember, when the Romans just leveled the Temple Mount, they just pushed a lot of it off the Temple Mount, and then it fell all around. And they found blocks that said the trumpet. When it was beginning of Shabbat, they didn't blow a shofar; they blew a trumpet. And the block says, "This is where you blow a trumpet." Okay, and they've had some pieces of the temple area that they've been able to find. Now, this was actually found. The Palestinians did some rebuilding on the Temple Mount without permission, and they took a lot of the waste and just dumped it somewhere. So the Israelis, when they found that out, were not happy, obviously, but they then sifted through piles of this debris and came up with a lot of interesting stuff, including these tiles.
Hmm.
All right, well, the last monument that we're going to consider is called Herodium. And I would guess nobody has been there because it's in the West Bank, right? You can go there, but it's not on the usual list of places to go. I want to go there. Okay, when I go to Israel again, I want to go there. Now, this whole idea that Herod did not, was not overcome by the way the land was set out. He decided he wanted a mountain fortress and palace here in this area. So he had a mountain built.
Is this a current? Is it, or is this a rendering?
This is a real thing.
This is what it
looks like now.
Okay.
It's over 2,000 feet high.
Wow.
I mean, can you imagine? Just incredible. He just he wanted it. He did it. Now, at the top there is a palace, and we'll get into that, as well as it's a fortress as well. And then down below there was a city. This is some of the city. A quite beautiful city, actually. So what's this about? This is a closer look at what it is today. And it had a palace. It had mikvahs. People wondered, well, was he really Jewish? Well, if you're building a palace, you don't have to put a mikvah in if you don't use it, right? I mean, so he was Jewish. He was Jewish. He considered himself Jewish. And in those days, it was not who your mother was that determined whether you were Jewish. It was who your father was. The maternal delimiting was much later in Jewish history. So even though his mother was not Jewish, she was from Nabatea, where Petra is in Jordan, the Nabatean, right. His father was Jewish, so that made him Jewish, according to Jewish law.
The Nabateans were another interesting group of people.
Yeah, they were.
And the engineering here is amazing.
Yeah, well, I mean, here is the area where where there was a city, and there was also places for people to stay who came to visit. There's a staircase that goes up, and they're not sure, but they think they found Herod's tomb, which we'll talk about in a bit, because Josephus, who was our major source for this, describes his burial actually, and here in Herodium. But there was a Jewish archaeologist that spent almost an entire career digging here and looking for the tomb, and a couple of years before he died, he found what he was convinced was the tomb. And then working on the area still, he fell and died. But I'll get into it a bit as to whether or not it really is his tomb or not. These are models about how it looked at the time. This is the palace at the top. Here's your amphitheater, right? So there was an amphitheater close to the palace, and then there was other things in the city for people. But who would come to this? Well, Herod would entertain people here, all right? So he had all the accoutrements. He had a full Roman bath, the whole thing, the tepidarium and this and that. So if you were a Roman potentate, you came here, you were really comfortable. You had everything you could possibly want. All right. All right. Okay, here's a picture of looking down on the mountain, right? You're looking at the palace and whatever. So what do we have? We have towers go all the way around. Remember, this is a fortress. Herod built palaces / fortresses close enough together that he would have, no matter where he was in the empire, if somebody tried to unseat him in a coup, he could get to a fortress quickly. So they were palaces, yes, but they also were fortresses. Synagogue, his living quarters. Here's the bathhouse. And there's a beautiful courtyard in here. Here's the mikvah. Now, see, it says to the cisterns. This is in a very arid area, like Masada. So the only way you can supply the water that you need, if there's not a river nearby that you can aqueduct from, is to store the water in cisterns. And there was an unbelievable cistern system here in this palace. They were outside cisterns, and they were below within the mountain top itself. This is a garden. Another shot of the garden just gives you some idea of the massive walls. This is a bath, part of the bath. This is where he lived. Here's the synagogue and mikvah. Same. Here's going down. Here's the mikvah going into the mikvah. All right, so you get the idea. So let's talk about whether this is his. Here's some of the storage places for water. Okay, and they're immense. There's just one, area. And during this Herodium was also used by the Zealots during the rebellion in 67, and was also used by Bar Kokhba in the 132 rebellion. Right? Tunnels all over the place as well. Tunnel system. Now, this is a copy of the sarcophagus that was found in this area, and they feel that, at least some people feel, it was the tomb of Herod. Now, the people who object feel that it's not ornate enough, that the area within it wasn't big enough. So, that's how they criticize. It doesn't look imposing enough. To me, it looks imposing enough. I don't know. But the sarcophagus that they found was smashed to smithereens. So if this was Herod, the people didn't even let him rest after he died. Okay? They had to go in there and smash. Nobody was found here. I mean, God knows what they did. So that's a commentary, I think, on how difficult it was for him. So I'm going to ask you now, how good a king was Herod?
Well, I would say because he was able to make peace with all of the parties around, like you mentioned um, that he was, that Israel was, or Judea was between two major parties, two major factions. It's a bad place to be. Somehow he managed most of the time, to keep the peace and make friends with both sides. So that would put him to the positive. And of course, we can see his engineering was just absolutely amazing. So,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah. Well, I mean, he understood that if you wanted any independence at all, you had to accommodate the Romans. And the
right.
Romans did give special dispensations to Jews. For example, they didn't expect Jews to serve in their army because of Shabbat. They exempted Jews from their army, and there were a whole series of things like that they did to try and bend over backwards to show that they could be flexible too. And
Well,
that flexibility would not have existed if it wasn't for somebody like Herod, who was able to show them that he was willing to be flexible himself.
well, weren't the Romans, I mean, they conquered lots of people, but they allowed, even up and through Germany and through France, Gaul, etc., allow the natives, use that term, to be semi-independent, as long as, like you said in the beginning, that they paid their taxes and paid homage to.
Right. Yeah, that was their preference. But if you rebelled, if you gave them trouble, they crushed you. I mean, just look what happened when there was a rebellion in 67, and then finally in 132, 135. I mean, they just, that was when they basically said no more Jews in Judea. I mean, we're going to kick most of them out. So you had to be flexible. The taxes were high at times. Now Herod actually would take his own money and pay the taxes if it was too onerous for his people.
Well, where did he get his money? Because that's one of the questions I was thinking of.
He got his money through taxation, like every head of government. But if there was famine, if there was difficulty, he would take the tax burden off the people. He wasn't trying to get blood out of a stone. I mean, he realized that he had to be flexible. There were times when he actually took grain, other foods that he had stored, and gave them to the people when it was of need. So, but if he hadn't maintained a flexible, positive relationship with the Romans, and it wasn't easy because Rome was unstable, with all these factions going back and forth, it was a real dance he had to do. If he hadn't been able to do that, they would have just crushed them and put in a governor, and that's it. Forget about being a king. And that's where it was a lot of Rome. There weren't kings in provinces. I mean, we went to Spain, there were no kings. It was just part of the Roman Empire. And but the Romans were just amazed about how difficult it was to administer the Jews. They just couldn't. They couldn't believe it. These people, they were bending over backwards, or tried to show that okay, we'll exempt you from this and exempt you from that because of your religion. They didn't have to make sacrifices to the emperor, which everybody else you had to make a sacrifice to the emperor to show that you were loyal. They exempted him from that. So only those that wanted to do it, but you didn't have to do it.
Okay.
And economically, which is another responsibility of the king, they didn't do as well. They had never done as well as they did under Herod economically. I mean, the country was became a major player in the Eastern Mediterranean. It never been before that.
Well, I guess I would describe Herod as being a great diplomat or statesman of the time.
Right. You just didn't want to be a member of his family, especially if you tried to. I mean, Augustus said that it was safer to be Herod's pig than to be in his family. And that showed you that Herod was Jewish because he didn't kill pigs, okay? But he was a very suspicious person, and he had some reason to be, but there's no doubt that he went way overboard. And it's like what's his name? I just can't get any respect. What's Dangerfield, Rodney Dangerfield? No matter what he did, okay, I'll rebuild your temple for you. They don't care. You're still a bad guy.
Hey, David, could you, as you finish with the slides, could you stop the screen share so that we can see the people that are here?
Yeah, absolutely.
I know people joined, but I don't know who. And so we gained Mike and Fern and Grace. Okay.
Yeah. Any other questions or comments?
An audience, but you didn't know it.
Yeah. Any other questions or comments before we wrap it up?
I
just want to apologize. I got the time mixed up, so I promise to be on time next time.
Okay.
You missed a good one.
Who else?
Somebody else was starting to
Yeah, there was
say.
somebody was starting.
Hi, yeah, it's Fern. I just want to thank you so much. This was really very informative and objective, and from a historical standpoint versus a religious standpoint per se. So I found that really refreshing, and I'd still like to know some of the religious aspects, but it's nice to do it from the historical component, which is tends
I
to
can give you a little bit of religious aspects.
Okay.
There were three major factions: the Sadducees, the Pharisees, and the Essenes. The Sadducees were upper class, a lot of them involved in temple priesthood, and strangely enough, were more willing to accept Hellenistic kinds of practices within the country. I mean, the Hashmoneans, who had started as a rebellion against, the Hellenic influences of the Syrian, the Seleucid Empire, ended up being very interested in Greek culture and ultimately Roman culture. And so I found that surprising when I read that, that they were the ones, the upper class. The Pharisees felt that were more sort of the forerunners of the rabbinical class. They accepted the oral law as just as important as the Torah, which the Sadducees did not. Sadducees were just interested in the Torah, period. Whereas the Pharisees were, in some ways positioning themselves for the creation of synagogues as a major part of the Jewish life. And there was a lot of antipathy between them, and they would sometimes have political repercussions. One group would back one Hashmonean king, the other one would, or prince, the other one would back another, and so there was really tension. Now the Essenes basically just said, I don't want to deal with either one of you. Okay, I mean, you're both annoying. I'm going to go off on our own. We're going to live in a male environment where all we do is pay attention to the religion. And so those were the three main factions. There were other factions as well. Who was the high priest was important. This was a Sadducee, but they also had to show some flexibility because they had a large number of people that wanted to see the religion branch out from the temple orientation. They just felt that the Torah itself was not enough, that it needed to be interpreted. And so that's sort of a thumbnail sketch of what the religious stuff. When you hear that Herod, killed a bunch of kids because he was worried about Jesus, there's only one mention of that. It's called the slaughter of the innocents. It's in Matthew in the New Testament. There's absolutely no other evidence that this happened. The dates don't line up. And also Josephus, who was not at all embarrassed about pointing out the negative things that Herod did, makes no mention of it whatsoever. So you would think that killing all 2-year-olds or something was something that would have been mentioned. So that's a bad rap for him, and that's not a religious. That's not part of his picture. Even though, if you look at Western art, the scene that is depicted when Herod comes in is the slaughter of the innocents.
So I have a question about,
Thank you so much.
Welcome. Go ahead, Lynn.
I have a question about the view from scholars and historians, and to what extent it's basically an agreement about his accomplishments,
Yeah.
or there's significant controversy. I know the sources are limited,
Yeah.
but I'm wondering whether that's created an opportunity to create scenarios where he's a great guy, he's a terrible guy,
Yeah.
and whether there's any agreement at this point.
All right, so let's sort of rank order the agreement. The greatest agreement are about his buildings. Okay, that you know, there's enough archaeological evidence plus very, very detailed descriptions, not just of Josephus, but other people, you know, other Romans who saw it and wrote about it. Okay, so there's pretty good agreement there. There's not an agreement on whether they've gotten his tomb or whatever, but there's good agreement for the most part on what he built, how he built it, and what the impact was. All right, now let's go to the next, okay? And that is about his foreign policy, okay? There's pretty good agreement there as well, okay? That how adept he was, how he dealt with various Roman leaders. The area where there is more disagreement is on how destructive and paranoid he was, okay? In other words, were there really plots that were being hatched? Was his mother-in-law trying to get him killed? Was his wife trying to get him killed? Were her sons trying to get him killed? And it's very, very difficult because the Romans, for the most part, did not comment on this stuff. So all you have is Josephus, basically. And so you're left with a lot of questions about it. I mean, you can say, for example, that he was heavy-handed in some aspects of his administration, and that made some of the people angry, that he was seeing plots where they didn't exist. You know, yeah, you can say these things, but I don't know how you can answer them or not. Certainly, if you believe in the slaughter of the innocents, you'll say, oh, see, that's just another example about how crazy he was. Now, we do know that what his physical symptoms were at the end of his life. And people wonder about what illness he has. And I've read a series of articles about doctors thinking, you know, what he had, because that's pretty awful. They're pretty sure he had kidney disease.
Okay.
But there's a bunch of other things that people argue about because he went really off the scale in the last 5 years of his life. Apparently, he was in terrible pain and all the rest. Now, were they really plotting against him at that point because he was vulnerable? I mean, who knows? So that I think, unless other sources are, you know, found, I don't know how those issues are going to be, addressed, and you know, so that's the level. That's the levels.
That's interesting to me because my mother, near the end, wouldn't drink water, so she became dehydrated, so she'd have a UTI, and she'd be in the hospital. But it was all with a whole feeling of paranoia.
Right.
she wouldn't drink water because she was convinced somebody was poisoning her.
Yeah.
Until I finally bought bottles where she could hear us opening them. You know, the snap of the lid. So, you know, it could have been as simple as a UTI.
Right.
That seems to be pretty common amongst all. How old was he when he died?
He was
Roughly.
in his 60s. I could give you an exact thing if I go back.
I said roughly.
Yeah, it's in his 60s.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you know, for that period of time, that was pretty good. But if you look at here, if you read the descriptions of the illness, I mean, he had some sort of larvae or coming out of his testicles. I mean, it was just awful stuff. And you know, and I'm sure his enemies felt that this was God's punishment, that he deserved.
Mm.
All right, so next time we're going to look at Cleopatra with an emphasis on Alexandria. This is the same period as Herod. They knew each other. They were competitors, and in the end, Herod was a lot more successful. But you know, so that's 2 weeks.